Good afternoon, everybody, if you're on the East Coast or Central, and good morning if you're on the West Coast. Great to be back at NACTO. We're very excited to be here and to talk about a program that the Knight Foundation has been funding and that CityFi, Urbanism Next, and 4 Amazing Cities have been executing around autonomous vehicles and shaping the future of automated mobility. My name is Gabe Klein. I'm co-founder of CityFi and partner at CityFi. Nico, you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Nico Larco. I'm the director of the Urbanism Next Center here at the University of Oregon, and here with Becky Seckler, who's also from University of Oregon and Urbanism Next.
And I'm with Cameron Bridgeford, who's been running this program from the CityFi side. Hind.
Hello, my name is Hind, and I'm representing the City of Detroit through the Office of Mobility Innovation.
Andrea.
And hello, my name is Andrea Ardona. I'm the Policy and Legislative Specialist for San Jose Department of Transportation, and I used to manage our micromobility program as well.
Great, next slide. So we started this program, I guess, a little over 2 years ago. And we've been working with the 4 cities on automation and the potential it has to have major positive impacts on cities, but also could have negative impacts. And so, how do you increase safety and help reduce congestion and pollution? Play to the strengths of technology, but not have the negative externalities that can come with it. Next slide. And by the way, if you hear a kid screaming, it might be mine. I will warn you now. So this is how it's set up. Knight Foundation is the generous funder for this project and really has a keen interest in the power of technology innovation to advance work across their key program areas, journalism, which this is not, although there is a purpose in putting this information out there. Communities, which this really does concern, and the arts, where there's a little bit of overlap. And so they really embrace the potential of 21st century tech to inform people, engage people in the civic and cultural life of their communities, and basically want to see positive outcomes come from tech. CityFi is a consultancy that translates civic complexity into smart strategies. We work with public, private, and we try to anticipate urban change with a sustainable, executable vision for the future. Many of you know Urbanism Next from their awesome conference, but they come from the University of Oregon and are really a primary source for information about the impacts of emerging tech, whether it's AVs, e-commerce, sharing economy, or urban development. And then, of course, our wonderful cities. Next slide. So we've got a diverse set of cities, 3 of which are what we call Knight cities. That means that they are one of the 23 cities that Knight Ridder operated in as a media company. And then we have a 4th city, which was involved because they have such interesting expertise in the AV area. They've really become a hotbed for AV testing on the East Coast, and that's Pittsburgh. Next slide. So in terms of what our key goals were, to boil it down, it was really to put people and stakeholders, whether it's small businesses, city council members, to put people at the center of the equation with this technology. And to, with tech, a lot of times it just sort of shows up in cities. We learned that with ride hailing. And so, what if people would be at the center and could actually have input into shaping how technology hit their streets? We also thought it was really important to have a feedback loop to the private sector so that they could understand what cities and people in their communities really want as they're designing these products. And we'll talk a little bit about the time scale of everything and why this has been important. And then, for cities to learn how do these things work. We were talking to Karina yesterday in Pittsburgh, and a bill was recently passed there that preempts them at the state level for sidewalk robots, up to 550 pounds on the sidewalks. And so, cities need to understand the pluses and minuses, and how do you have equitable outcomes and impacts and deployments across cities. Next slide. So let's quickly, talk about the state on the streets out there. Next slide. First of all, the rate of change, a lot of it due to technology, some of it due to business models evolving at a very rapid clip with technology, is challenging cities to keep up. And as many of you know who are from cities, and I ran the Chicago Department of Transportation, the DC Department of Transportation, one city, one technically state DOT, resources have been dwindling even when the economy was good. And so it's very challenging for cities to adapt to this level of change. They can't maintain status quo if they want to proactively shape their streets and meet the community's needs, often with the private sector, but not subject to the private sector. So, one of the questions is, what is the role of government in AV innovation? Next slide. And we have this symbiotic relationship. We have all these interesting new business models. Some are peer-to-peer ownership, some are fleet models. But despite, some of which has been really innovative, some has been more hype-oriented from VCs, the technologies, ebbed and flowed, I would say slowed a bit. And so the community readiness, is also changing. Government regulations are really fighting to keep pace with all this change. And all of these new services are being introduced into a more complex mobility landscape, often new form factors, different versions of the same technology. Next slide. And there've been major hiccups, whether it's rushing technology to the streets to test it versus in the cloud or on test tracks, or actually rushing it to market. And there's been these big errors and problems which can affect people's lives. This has given cities pause, as we think it should. And it's caused really a conversation about, what are automated driving systems? What is autonomy? What is self-driving? And many of the companies themselves really want to differentiate them from each other and say, we are safe. Next slide. And so, a combination of things have resulted in a bit of a reality check about what's real, what's sort of VC fueled either hype or pushing the market to show progress that maybe isn't quite there. Also, the differences in context in highway, suburban, arterial, urban contexts, and then forced us, I would say, to ask, and when I say us, I mean cities, citizens, people like the Knight Foundation, what are we really hoping to get out of autonomy at the end of the day? And I would say that this has been a blessing to this program, and it makes our efforts that much more important, because we felt like we were rushing in to help cities to sort of catch up and have a say. And now we feel much more like we're on a timeline with industry, and we can have more impact. And this, by the way, is a 4 or 5 year program. Next slide. So, the AV tech that people will see on their streets is a little bit different than what I think people envisioned maybe 4 years ago, which was robo taxis. Uber and Lyft were on the rise, and people thought, okay, we're just going to see robo taxis. That is what AV technology is. But it's much more. And the fastest or first market entry point is likely not self-driving cars necessarily, but it's easier use cases with fewer edge cases. It's sidewalk delivery. It's drones, drones in the heartland. It's highway trucking. Next slide. So, to recap here, this is about the speed of change as well as these broad impacts. What's the role of cities and government in general, the federal government also, NHTSA, so forth. And what's the reality and projections of AV deployment? And how does that impact cities? And how are we going to work within that context? Next slide. And then, of course, the overlay on all of this is COVID, which has changed the market dynamic dramatically. And I think there are a lot of questions about, is this temporary, where we're starting to see, people doing things differently during COVID, or is this speeding up trends such as e-commerce, delivery, remote work, that were already in the works and just bringing them 5 years faster? But it's also changing the focus for autonomy. Next slide. As a result, some of our cities, and we have San Jose actually with us today, have pivoted a bit or thought about, what would an overlay of a delivery pilot look like in our city? So something we've been looking at is what would an overlay of a delivery pilot look like across all 4 cities as a cohort. We haven't made a decision with Knight where we're going with that, but it is interesting with delivery, whether it's on the street and bike lanes or in sidewalks, and obviously that's controversial, but it's lower tech and it's also less regulatory challenge at the state level. And these things are coming, as I mentioned. There are, I think, 33 states that have preemptive legislation that allow these in cities. And so figuring out how these work is also potentially a very important part of this project. Thanks for listening to that opening, and I'm going to turn it over to Nico to talk about the long game and the equity framework.
Great, thanks. So as mentioned, I'm Nico Larco from Urbanism Next Center, and as Gabe was saying, the big question we want to present here and have a dialogue about is this question of, like, how is it that as AVs arrive into our landscapes in whatever forms they are, how do we make sure that equity is a question that we're thinking about and that these don't only land for the wealthy, for instance, right? So we're hoping to present this material to you here, how we're thinking about it, but we'd love to have this conversation afterwards. So please do put your questions into the chat so we can have this good dialogue going. So if you go to the next slide, one of the things that's absolutely clear is that if the tech was ready and arrived at our cities, tomorrow, generally cities are not ready. And when I say cities, it's not just the cities, the government part, but all the stakeholders that are involved. And I might even put the private sector into a piece of that. And that what's really needed is a ton of learning. This is a complicated, wicked problem that includes everything from stakeholder engagement to understanding what the impacts of these things might be, to figuring out how to shape outcomes, and to developing trust with all the different people involved. And so what's pretty clear is that there needs to be a whole lot of incremental learning, and we really need to think about this long game, not simply how do we implement an equitable deployment, but all the learning that is needed to get to that piece. And that there's no ideal pilot or project or regulation that is going to let us do all those things. I would think that's likely impossible because of the complexity of all this. And so what we're really doing is, I think something that probably many of you are also working on as well, is like, how do we get to the point where we can get to this equitable deployment? So what are the key issues around this? And we're going to present an AV equity initiative framework that hopefully will be helpful to all of you to think about that. And then how do you create a roadmap through pilots, through regulations you're going to be putting in place to get you to eventually an equitable deployment? And one of the things that we're really leaning heavily on is this idea of proxy pilots as a key. So proxy pilots are this idea that things such as TNCs, scooters, bike share, are all ways to start getting information about some of these topics that we really need to learn about. And drones and robots, as Gabe said, are actually great proxies for eventual transportation of people. And so that's a lot of what we're working on. So I'm going to present you the next slide. The kind of a framework that we developed to try to get our arms around what are the topics we really need to be thinking about, right? So and we've seen kind of there's these two parts. On the one hand, there's community engagement. So how is it that we figure out what the community and our city really needs out of this to make sure it's equitable? And the other side is shaping deployment. How do we make sure that then the things that we need, how do we get those things to actually translate to actual actions that help us with the equity goals? So this is a large topic, and we have a white paper that it's like a couple weeks away from being, we're hoping to be done by now, but it's we're in layout mode right now, so it should be done very shortly. So I'm going to talk briefly about each one of these pieces and then pass it on to cities. From the engagement approach, it's really this idea of, next slide, thank you. Things that we all know, how do we amplify voices? Being clear on purpose is super important because we're not providing deployments that have every piece of them and already are equitable. We really need to be clear on purpose. Sometimes deployments might really just be to get touch and feel, to get people to understand what the technologies are. We need to respect people's time and experience and oftentimes pay for it, and building trust is critical. Next slide. So this is a more, I'm going to go through this quickly, but these are the topics we've asked ourselves. If we're thinking about how we talk to people, which is how we're engaging with them, next piece is, what are the key topics we really need to think about as we talk to different stakeholders when it relates to equity? And so we've kind of divided up into these two main pieces: individual level factors and societal level factors. I'm just going to go through them really quickly. So this, you could think of this a little bit as a checklist, or the topics as you talk to your stakeholders, things that you need to be talking to them about, for instance. So on the geographic side, are the services that are coming, do they fit with the needs of the people that we're trying to target? And will services be available to them, right? Will it be consistent? On the financial side, can people afford these things? Can it affect different forms of payment, especially for people who are unbanked? And again, these are the types of things that we can be looking at in a whole bunch of proxy pilots for this. Do people have smartphone access? Do they need to have smartphone access? In terms of trust and comfort, if they have the smartphone, do they know how to use it? Is it in languages that they are comfortable using? Do they have a sense of ownership of this whole thing? And is a service consistent? We saw a whole lot of things, especially with COVID, right? Where all of a sudden, and even before COVID, where services were being pulled away. And so it's very hard for people to rely on these things. In terms of accessibility, are the vehicles themselves accessible? Can you put your goods, your travel aids, so walkers, wheelchairs, things like that within them? In safety and security, is it physically safe for you, both getting in, getting out, and being within it? Is there personal security in terms of if this is shared rides? How do we deal with the security between people? And how do we make sure that our privacy is being taken care of? So those are all individual level factors. On societal level factors, we have transportation outcomes that when we think about equity, which is this really serving the underserved specifically? And really important, is this having detrimental effects for transit? So one of the big questions you've seen with TNCs is this tends to pull away riders away from transit. So if we've developed this AV world and it pulls people away from transit, is that going to actually hurt overall outcomes for vulnerable communities? On the environmental side, thinking about things like carbon emissions and where those carbon emissions are happening, right? And thinking about, again, the equity impacts. And on the economic side, is this creating jobs, and for who? And are the profits being invested locally? So you can think of this, as I said, again, as almost a checklist, topics to cover when you're talking with your community. So again, there's going to be a white paper coming out that has all this more in depth, but you can think about this as issues you can cover when you're talking to your community about these topics. Next slide. So the next piece of it is really thinking about, so if that helps us understand what the issues are, and then the next piece is, how do we shape that deployment? Next slide. So one of the things that we found that cities are often not exactly self-aware about is what their model of governance is around this, how much they're taking control of different pieces of the of the interaction with, for instance, the private sector. Is it little intervention where they're just facilitating, allowing the thing to happen, enabling legislation, or are they really like kind of micromanaging all the way through? And this, I think, is a really important thing for cities to start to be self-aware of, and then also kind of take the reins on. And it might be different for different pilots or different parts of the whole deployment. Next slide. And then this is I'll spend a little bit more time on this, which is, once you've figured out how it is that you want to interact with this, how much control you want, what are your tools and levers for making control? And this is really a mix of carrots and sticks here, but it's what our ability to shape both with direct regulations, right? But also things that might not be traditional controls. So for instance, education coordination. One of the things that we're finding, so you can go to the next slide, is public outreach and education are really important to the private sector, and they're things that cities are often doing already. So Are you helping to educate the public about AVs? Are you trying to figure out what the mobility needs are? Next slide. Are you coordinating with the stakeholders? So everything from creating AV working groups, doing cross-agency coordination. These are all things, providing political assistance. These are all things that cities can be doing to help with the entire process. And you can leverage those things. This is a fairly big carrot that you can leverage to get some of the things, outcomes that you want in this. Next slide. This is the allowing, shaping, assisting the services. This is really more on the stick side of things, regulations you can put into place to help shape deployment. So things are, do you allow the thing in the right of way? So just general allowing the deployment, liabilities and responsibilities. Companies are really interested in figuring out how exactly that works and having that clarified. Next slide. Lots that cities can do to help shape the market itself in terms of, we're already seeing this a whole lot, especially in the world of scooters. Are you limiting the number of operators? Are you limiting the number of vehicles? Are you reducing barriers to entry? And how do you ensure compliance? And how does ensuring compliance actually secure that there's not going to be a race to the bottom in this, right? Operational limits, this is a longer list, but this is really some of the more traditional things that we've thought of that cities can be doing to regulate control, right? So everything from requiring permits to operate, putting in, and we're seeing this throughout cities throughout the country with VMT limitations, or cruising minimums, things like that, charging taxes and fees, a whole slew of things that we can be looking at here. Process assistance. This is one that a lot of cities are actually experimenting with, which is how do you do things like make procurement easier? Just dedicating staff to this, so that there's a place that's creating like kind of answers and coordinating internally. And do you allow variances to allow some of these pilots to happen? How easy are you allowing that or not allowing that? And then finally, from this section is thinking about, are you providing direct financial assistance? So are you giving grants, for instance, for some of these pilots to happen if you feel like they coincide well with community goals? Or are you actually purchasing these services? Are you, almost a franchisee helping pay for these things? Next one. And then the last one is this question of infrastructure investment. On the technology and data side, so are you requiring data and platforms like what LA kind of pioneered, right, with MDS? Are you requiring data sharing requirements, right? Not just what the platform is, but the sharing is happening. Are you providing technology resources to these companies? Lots of companies we've talked to are really interested in knowing what's happening in the right of way. So is there construction going on? Is there an event happening? So can you share that information? And then the last one there, integrating booking and payment, as the cities can take a role in helping make those standards happen and creating that. LA is, again, is a leader in next step of what they're trying to do there. And that's a huge kind of way to shape the entire deployment. And then the last piece is the physical infrastructure. So do you have AV ready streets? Are you managing any of the space specifically for AVs? Curbside management, obviously, is a huge issue. We're already seeing that with TNCs. Are you doing that for AVs? So those kinds of things. So next slide. So generally the idea is like that this framework helps kind of define the range of things that we need to know about, cities need to know about, and stakeholders need to know about to be able to get to equitable deployment. So what are the topics you need? So asking the community the what, and then how do you deploy that, right? So that's the shaping deployment side. Next slide. So the idea is that we can use this if we think about the long game, right? And we're trying to chip away at this. This framework helps us understand what we know and what we don't know. And from that, then, each city can kind of create a roadmap to say, what are the things that we really need to learn next? What are the next few steps we need to make? And how do we create pilots that help us get that information, which might be specifically equity focused or might not be equity focused, right? It might really just be learning some more about the landscape so that we can push things forward. So a way to fill up gaps in knowledge. So from that, I'll pass it on to Hind, who's going to talk about how they're specifically filling up those gaps in knowledge with a lot of the pilots that are happening over there.
Hello, my name is Hind, and I am representing the city of Detroit. Since we are part of the cohort of 4 cities as part of the Knight Foundation grant, we've been using this framework that Nico just mentioned, and together we are all focusing on the long game of AV deployments, and I'll cover our perspective on this on the following slides. So cities are faced with the undoubtful arrival of AV technology, whether we're ready for them or not. And so this is pushing us to ask the question, what do we need to learn around AVs before we go into full deployments in our streets? So what this means is that we need to understand the standards for how the private sector must conduct AV outreach and operations within our cities. And more specifically, as Nico mentioned earlier, although we are not ready for full deployments right now, at least in Detroit, we now know the questions we need to answer to get to a level of readiness that will foster equitable outcomes from AV technologies. And so what this means is that we're asking ourselves questions around how should AV technology serve equity groups? And what that means is groups such as seniors above 55, low-income households, youth who are under 18, and people who are living with disabilities. Another question is, how can AV technology promote accessibility to jobs, to healthcare, and other essential services that we offer at the city? How can AV technology deployment be transparent and promote trust between residents, the city, and private sector? And then lastly, what are the economically sustainable ways that this technology can deploy and operate within city limits? So we got to outlining these questions through lessons that we already learned through non-AV related pilots, as well as future deployments that we have in the pipeline. So, and I will be covering these in the next 3 slides. So first, we have learned something from a pilot that was serving DDOT customers, which is the Detroit Department of Transportation, and specifically focusing on customers who work at night, hence the name Night Shift. We expanded this pilot to all essential workers who had challenges commuting at night during COVID-19. We also increased the code value that we offered. As you see here, it's $7, but we increased it to $15 during COVID to make sure that workers were able to get back home, whether the bus showed up or not, since it is still operating at reduced capacity. So essentially, this was supposed to cover that last mile for folks to get home, but we expanded it to 15 so that whether they are able to cover the last mile or if they need to cover the whole leg of the trip, that they are able to. The lesson that we learned from this is that adoption rates are slow with new technology, contrary to what many have warned us against. We were warned that the grant funds that we had for this pilot were going to disappear in the first month because residents were just going to jump on this. This is like, free lift codes, and that they would be taking advantage of the service. But then, so what ended up happening is that we took these warnings, and so we put up more requirements and eligibility criteria and kind of more barriers to entry for folks to use the service, only to open it back up again because folks just don't trust new things that you offer them right away. Like, people were not, taking advantage of the service. They were actually using it to get to and from work. And so we ended up just removing all these barriers to entry. So adoption is slow when you're offering something new to residents because there needs to be that trust to be built. Next is another example of a lesson learned from a different pilot. This is a pilot we ran as a response to COVID-19 as well, to respond to transportation challenges that we were facing here. And it was focused on essential employees that were able to, through this program, able to use a scooter or an electric bike for 4.5 months. So between mid-June all the way to the end of October. And essential employees were able to have access to these vehicles for 24/7 under a leasing model at a nominal fee of a one-time nominal fee of $10, as opposed to the shared vehicle model. So we had a leasing model instead. Vehicles were being provided by Spin for the scooters. We had 150, and then the bikes were donated by GM and operated by the local bike share program. The lesson we learned from this is essentially how to go about outreach for the purpose of behavioral change and mode shift. That we learned that in order to gain trust in times of COVID, at least, where we couldn't do in-person outreach, we had to pick up the phone and make more than 160 phone calls between my colleague and I that could last anywhere between 10 minutes to 40 minutes to not only inform the residents about this service, but also be able to be there and have personalized and offer personalized education to anyone who was skeptical and was not trusting of the offering. So we kind of had to go the extra mile and realize that efficiency just meant something different during COVID, even if it meant, calling all of the residents all the essential workers who were eligible for this. So now I will transition to a direct AV deployment pilot with a 3 to 4 year timeline. And we have many partners who are also involved with this pilot, and it's funded through a US DOT grant. The main objectives from this pilot are first to test the hypothesis that transportation is linked to health outcomes, such that easier access to transportation through technology advancements can actually provide for improved health outcomes, specifically for residents who are seniors and live with disabilities. Secondly, the objective is to accelerate the deployment of ADS technology by enabling a heightened level of comfort among both regulators and users, and among other stakeholders as well. The lesson that we are hoping to learn from this, or the lessons that we're hoping to learn from this, is the ability for autonomous vehicles to improve health outcomes for two equity groups, as I mentioned earlier, so seniors and people living with disabilities. We're not sure about all of what these groups will help us learn yet, but the goal is to focus on safety, whether it is practical or perceived, focus on data collection and analysis, and lastly, focus on collaboration between all of the 9 partners who are actually major players in the future of autonomous vehicles, whether in Southeast Michigan or beyond. So overall, we believe it is very important to run pilots focused on equity and with both the private and public sectors involved, while also involving the community as a key partner and stakeholder really in the testing and learning process for this. So next comes the question, why do, next slide, please. So why do equity-focused pilots matter? And I believe this matters for 3 reasons. Internally, it allows city government and the private sector to learn about each other's processes and develop understanding of each other's goals. The targeted testing nature of pilots kind of allows stakeholder to be able to pinpoint the gaps in strategy as shown by data collected and the process undertaken, as opposed to run after other success metrics. In terms of vision for a big scale project, success metrics can focus on solving the true need of the community, as opposed to being tech-based solely. And then lastly, economically, it champions listening and learning over profit. And this means that the economic pressure is kind of removed. Therefore, the lens of service and the lens of equity are not blurred by other goals. And so, yeah, so this concludes my presentation. Thank you, and feel free to reach out to me directly through the email I put in the next slide, yeah, through the Q&A section. And I'll pass it on to Andrea.
Thank you, Hind. Apologies, I had to change my setting because my kids are making some noise where I was. I wanted to share with all of you what we have learned through some demonstration pilots that we have developed for the city of San Jose and that are going on. We've deployed at one phase of an autonomous vehicle demonstration pilot that started in November last year and ended in March this year because of COVID-19. And at the same time, when COVID-19 hit, we saw the opportunity to test sidewalk delivery bots in certain areas of the city to take advantage of the need for touchless deliveries at this time. Next, please. So first, I wanted to describe a little bit what these pilots are about. So the demonstration pilot with Mercedes, Bosch, and Daimler is basically a 3-phase long pilot, and we've only completed 1 taste. It's all testing environment. And the idea is to learn how could we best integrate autonomous vehicles into our current transportation system. So as opposed to piloting a service per se, we want to try to understand what are the challenges and the opportunities before we launch a service. Of course, the company has wanted to beta test the ride-hailing app, and they were relying on a very limited number of mostly employee-based users to test this. I've also wanted to understand what would be the software app integration challenges for data sharing, and most importantly, we wanted to evaluate community and safety concerns related to these types of pilot. We also had in the pipeline another pilot with AutoX that was intended to connect our main rail station, Derrida Station, with San Jose State University campus in replacement of a free shuttle route that was eliminated for students. But unfortunately, because of COVID-19, that pilot has been suspended. Next, please. So the sidewalk delivery pilot that we have with KiwiBot is basically an agreement pilot. We don't have any legislation that would prevent these types of devices from deploying in San Jose and launching a service. However, we engage in a very, very close partnership with KiwiBots as well to make sure that all of the sort of like operational requirements that you would see in a permit to prevent, issues of safety or address community concerns that we've already identified will be taken care of. So it was a very close, it has been a very close partnership relationship to enable this service. So it's still pretty much in a beta test mode. They can deliver to customers. So they are delivering during COVID-19. And we are evaluating sort of like the feasibility of this type of robot that goes on sidewalks in very different urban contexts. This will not work, of course, in areas where we have very narrow sidewalks or where we have a very high volume of pedestrians going on. So really trying to identify challenges and opportunities for similar automated mobility services. What would be the barriers? What are the barriers that a community are experiencing with this type of service today? And how can we address that looking down the road? We are also trying to assess accessibility needs from the perspective of businesses and other communities. Can mom and pop neighborhood restaurants access this service? So really focusing on testing very low cost solutions for both users and businesses. And of course, we want to explore similar to what we did with the AV pilot that I explained before. We want to test, equity-based use cases. Can you deliver to vulnerable communities for a very low cost? So this is where we are with this pilot right now, and we anticipate that it will continue to go until June, at least until June 2021. Next, please. So really these pilots have been possible, and we've learned a lot because we are learning as partners with these companies, and we're learning through community engagement. So in the case of the Mercedes-Benz Daimler pilot, the city and the companies co-presented during community meetings to be able to address community concerns as partners. We engage different groups, especially the San Jose Police Department, very early and often to test different scenarios and learn through iteration. So there were, although this was a very fixed route, we tested different model, basically different scenarios. What happens if the police wants to stop a vehicle because of an emergency? How would they approach it? How can they make stop the vehicle? What happens if there's a collision? Testing all of this and going through iterations to see how the technology can help us get where we want in terms of safety. We also joined ongoing testing and feedback sessions with vulnerable communities, especially visually impaired communities, to ensure that these AVs are being designed with those that may benefit the most in mind. We want to make sure that we are checking on all of the challenges and opportunities that we have and that we can learn through iteration. With the Kiwibots pilot, we haven't had the opportunity to engage the community as actively because of COVID-19, but we have been coordinating very closely with Kiwibots, anywhere from service delivery, through how can we support business development for the very specific equity use cases that we want to achieve. We've been offering ongoing engagement support to make sure that Kiwibots is aligned to our goals and the community goals. Everything that they do is coordinating with our Vision Zero team. We are learning about our curb and trying to manage our curb with these types of devices. We're trying to understand how we can improve community access to these types of service. And most importantly, we actually took a very deep dive on data sharing with Kiwibots and asked them to report to us data in MDS, in the micromobility data specification, similarly to what e-scooter companies report to other cities. So we are receiving real-time data from Kiwibots, and we can monitor Kiwibots operations, understand how many deliveries they're doing almost on a real-time basis. And we're also learning about safety concerns when we see this data in real time before incidents actually happen. Next, please. So our strategy is basically building these very strong partnerships to address community concerns and using the data that we're getting from these pilots to learn and adapt as we go through iteration. So this data and these pilots can really help cities identify challenges and opportunities in very specific locales, because it's very hard at this point to say, this is how it's going to work in cities. We understand now that we really need to look at the very specific conditions in our urban environment to understand how to adapt to this and how to better serve our community. So we learned that we need to collect data and insights early to identify the infrastructure needs that we are going to have in the future to accommodate AVs. So we are collecting that information from the Kiwibots pilots as well. We are also identifying accessibility barriers. We want to make sure that this is, Kiwibots or AVs are not delivering, $500 products, but perhaps a $500 meal, or perhaps a toothbrush that is needed for a member of the community that cannot come out and get it by himself in COVID times. We're also evaluating community acceptance. I mean, new things are difficult to bring into new communities. So we are coordinating with Kiwibots expansion based on community acceptance, and that varies by neighborhood and community. And of course, we are also identifying our regulatory needs. What do we need to have in place in order to make sure that we're doing what we need to do to fill the needs of the community and to ensure safety? So all of that is something that we are constructing through these demonstration pilots. Next, please. So the results, some of the results that we can show about this now is this very rich data transfer between the city and these mobility providers are serving us a lot. And in the case of the autonomous vehicle pilot, we collected information. These vehicles had a lot of sensors, and they can collect information about pedestrian volumes at mid-block intersections. And we learned and shared with our Vision Zero team, about critical points in which pedestrians do cross at mid-block and are facing a lot of challenges at that point. So that informs us to understand where do we need to do more research and where do we need to invest in infrastructure to make sure that there's safe infrastructure for pedestrians. With Kiwibots, it's been a similar scenario. The map that you see in the right shows basically the difficult intersections for the bots. So if a sidewalk delivery bot
Oh, I think we might have lost Andrea. I think, oh, I think we might have just lost Andrea. So I'm going to jump in and she comes back, we can finish up. But so we've got about 15 minutes for Q&A and we'll start out with that. So I'll just start. So first of all, for those of you who don't know, Gabe is on the Biden transition team and he has had to jump to another meeting, which we're happy to have him do that. So a lot of the questions that we're getting, oh,
sure if
Andrea,
I'm
you
not
there?
sure if you're hearing me.
Now we're
I
hearing
got
you.
booted.
Are you there? Nope. Okay. We'll see if she comes back. So a lot of the questions that we're getting in the chat have to do with, well, I just see, Andrea, you there?
Yes, my apologies. For some reason, I got booted out, but that was basically the end of the presentation. I know there are some questions already in the chat. So let's go ahead and address those.
Okay, great. Thanks, Andrea. So one of the questions, a theme for many of the questions, and I encourage people to continue to put questions into the chat, is what do you do in terms of, this technology doesn't exist. How do you engage communities about this? What should you be doing to prepare? And I think probably one of the biggest lessons learned, I think, from the first 2 years of working on this project is sometimes engaging the community directly about these topics is not the best avenue for this, right? So I think that vulnerable communities, especially, to have technologies which might not be proven yet, is not it's a little bit of experimenting on people without really knowing what the implications for it will be. That said, I think this idea of the long game, of trying to understand all the little pieces, is really tremendously important. And so, like, education with community stakeholders is really important, and that might be everything from education around AVs, but also just education on how the models might roll out. So I'll just really quickly give an example of Pittsburgh, and then I'll pass it to Andrea and Andrea and Hin to answer this question as well. But Pittsburgh did a pilot with Starship to, in the words of some of the people working there, deliver burritos to college students, right? And this is not a tremendously equitable scenario that they were doing, right? They're just helping this company figure out how to do this and how the service works. Well, it was tremendously important for them, as Gabe mentioned. The state ended up passing preempting legislation, more or less, that said you had to allow these things. And the conversation that they were able to have with all of their stakeholders, because they did this burrito, like this Starship pilot, was critical, essential to the conversations they were having. So the idea is you should really engage, lean into the pilots that you have with, new mobility, with TNCs, with scooters, and leverage these to figure out, educate the community, educate your staff, build skills, develop relationships with the private sector, so that eventually, as these technologies come online, the AV technologies come online, you have that developed. And so it's really the long game that you're doing. So you can use the framework that we talked about to kind of think about what you know and what you don't know, and then develop these pilots to help fill in those gaps so you're ready when the technologies arrive. Hind, Andrea, what would you say to those questions?
I think that's really a great question, and it ties into Abdullahi's question as well about, how can the equity conversations start before these technologies are designed and deployed. And so for us, first and foremost, we are using the grant so that Detroit residents can really shape how AVs operate in their city, and also that AVs are used by residents to serve their needs. And the way we're doing this is by dedicating a large portion of the grant to, first and foremost, introducing residents to these technologies before they are even a service. So we're doing this concept called the touch and feel events. And essentially what it is bringing these technologies to neighborhoods in partnership with community managers and community organizations, and actually bringing an autonomous vehicle into someone's neighborhood, bringing an electric bike into someone's neighborhood, and even, allowing them to get into the vehicle, come out of the vehicle, and really just be able to concretely experience the technology before we even ask them, hey, ride on this autonomous shuttle and, you know, risk your life if you do that. And so, and through these events, we hope that we'll be able to follow up with focus groups and in-depth interviews to dig deeper into questions around how can we come up with a portfolio of like, you know, a design portfolio for like how things should be for seniors versus how do youth perceive these vehicles and how do they want them to be introduced in their communities and schools, etc. So yeah, so definitely a great question, and we are dedicating a large portion of the grant just for that.
Andrea?
Yeah, and I will add to that one of the things that we've learned by doing these demo pilots and engaging with the community and learning through iteration is that there's a big mismatch still about the needs of the community right now and what these autonomous vehicles are trying to develop. So what we're trying is to bridge these two. We know that this is going in a way, what we want to make sure is that it's serving the entire community. So really working together in partnerships, I think, is one of the most important aspects that we have built into these demonstration pilots to learn as much as we have learned, and also to be able to tailor to very specific community needs at the neighborhood level. I think that has helped build a lot of acceptance, for example, with KiwiBots. And we see now with KiwiBots something interesting. When a robot tilts over for some reason, we have members of the public actually coming to aid the robot. So there is this awareness that this is a service to the community already in the areas where they're operating. And that's very exciting.
And I just want to add as well, like Andrea made me realize as well that, so another thing that we're trying to do is that by doing this before an AV deployment, or by learning from an AV deployment, we as cities are better able to communicate to the private sector what we need them to develop for our residents. So it's kind of like a win-win, not just for all stakeholders, for residents, for the private sector, and for the public sector.
Yeah. I'll also say, I mentioned it before, but I think one of the things is just being really clear about purpose, both to yourself and to the community that you're working with. So, both Hind and Andrea mentioned kind of these touch and feel pilots, where the idea is not to provide specifically a service that's going to get you to your job, right? Or get you, right? The idea is just to introduce people to what these things are, so you can then have a conversation eventually when the services are available to get you to your job. So being really clear with the community of what setting expectations, right? Level setting with everyone, and internally to your staff and to, oftentimes your political leadership of what the purposes for these things are. So really don't oversell and figure out what the value is in the things that you're learning. There's a question that was asking about what kinds of things, what was it here? So what if cities are trying to figure out what kind of investments to make in like infrastructure, what kind of guidance would you give, Andrea and Hind, with this unknown future that we're going to have?
So we're taking, like I mentioned during the presentation, what we're taking from these pilots is a lot of data that helps us understand where do we need to do more research in order to improve or adapt our infrastructure and make sure that these new services are connected with our transportation landscape. And that we're doing at a micro level at this point, but we anticipate we will be able to expand that to the entire city boundaries. So we're really using these pilots to learn about our own infrastructure needs for what is coming in the future. So that is a larger question, because it also helps us understand what are our funding gaps in order to achieve what we need to achieve, and where do we need to invest first. So what it allows us to do is be more strategic about that in terms of infrastructure.
Yeah, so we also know that just at a federal level, there has been like a prioritization of, budgeting for building and maintaining roads instead of financing public transit at an 80-20 rate. And we're hoping that this is going to change in the future, and there are some signs that it might. And once that happens, at least the work that we're doing right now is going to be informing how that funding, which requires a large budget, large budgets can be financed and for what purpose. Also, in addition to that, there's a project right now that is a major project that has been announced in Detroit is to link the city of Detroit with the city of Ann Arbor, called Cavenue, and the feasibility study of that project is going to be done within the next 2 years to assess the feasibility for an autonomous vehicle corridor. And so by feasibility, it's not just the feasibility of the infrastructure, but also taking into account the communities that that corridor is going to go through, etc. So yeah, infrastructure is definitely a big question on our mind, but at least in our office, the priority right now is to generate as much data and lessons learned as possible, in addition to building a great AV constituency within our residents to prepare for those shifts.
I'll add two things. There was also a question asking about what kind of what infrastructure needs do AV need? What infrastructure requirements do AVs have? I'll say most all the companies that I've spoken to, in fact, all the companies I've spoken to about AV companies I've spoken to have said they generally will work within what exists, right? The road infrastructure that exists. So, in terms of 5G or any special sensors and technology within the roads, the general idea is we don't need those kinds of things to be able to operate, because if we did, the amount of roads we'd be able to operate on in the country would be severely limited. So don't need to do that. But going back to the question then of how to figure out how to invest, I think a big thing, and Gabe says this as well, is you got to figure out how you future-proof and you build flexibility into the system. I think one of the big pieces that I think it should be evident in this whole idea of a long game is we don't know what the final piece is going to look like. So if you're building and you're planning with a short time frame, if you're building with a long time frame on things that exist today, the chances are everything's going to shift before you get there. So figuring out how you can build in flexibility at every single point and don't overbuild capacity that you're not going to need is absolutely critical. I think absolutely critical. We've got about a minute left, so I'll just ask Andrea and Hind, any last thoughts, or Becky, anything you want to add?
No, not from my end.
Becky or Andrea?
Nothing else here.
Yeah, great. So we invite you to, we know cities all over the country are dealing with this, either directly because you've got leadership that's asking for this, or you've thought about it coming at you, or if you're not, it's going to be coming at you, right? As one of the questions early on said, the technology is coming if we'd like it or not. So figuring out how best we address these things, I think, is really important, and we're really tremendously thankful for the Knight Foundation putting attention and resources into this. We're going to have a couple of different pieces coming out, some white papers that are coming out. There will be a Medium site announced shortly, where more of the learnings across this is going to be put out. But we'll hope we can be a resource for everyone, and that we would love to hear what kind of issues you're running into as you move forward on these topics. Thank you so much, and thanks to NACTO for including us in the conference.